Okay. Okay, then, good evening. We're going to try something new here. As you can see, I'm not in my natural habitat, but I'm in my natural habitat. I'm not in the shul, where I usually would be speaking. At the time that I originally drafted the idea of this series, which was 2 months ago, it was my hope at that time that when we get to June already, the coronavirus will be behind us and things will be normal, and I could have the series that I do every June in the shul as I usually do. But immense tracht and Gott lacht. Man proposes and God disposes, and obviously that's not possible yet. We in Baltimore are still in a situation where the synagogues are still closed, let alone having an audience there. And so it was then my intention to do the actual lecture in the shul to an empty room and just have Yossi Wetstein, the heroic Yossi Wetstein, running the video and all the rest of it. But it appeared in the last several days that the most efficient way of running this particular series turns out to be from my own house. And even though I'm not exactly used to this, but we will all get used to this at the same time. I have to thank my son Yehuda Leib for Herculean efforts putting everything together today. And if this is working and you're seeing this and you're hearing me and everything in a good way, then you owe him a debt of gratitude, as well as we always owe a debt of gratitude, my tech team, to Howard Elbaum for putting together the PowerPoint, to Yossi Wetstein, who's going to do wonders with it. And without any further ado, we'll get down to business. The name of this series is called Jews and War, Calculations, Miscalculations, and Catastrophes. That's the name of the series. And I originally conceived of this, I was thinking about the Holocaust, because, in my opinion, most people don't understand what the Holocaust exactly how it came about. That's just my opinion. And I'm going to at least share my opinion of all that. But in order to do that, you have to situate it within a grand narrative of Jews and war in general. And you'll see what I mean if you follow through as I go through the planned course of these 6 talks, or where I'm going with this. And tonight, I begin the first lecture of 6, which is entitled Limited War and Unlimited War in Ancient Times. And this is not, as you'll see in a minute, some kind of all-star team, famous American Jewish soldiers or anything like that. I'm not into that at all. But rather, I'm concerned in this series, especially tonight, with the question of Jews and the phenomenon of war. So without any further ado, let me get down to my remarks. And here we go. I begin by raising the question, how does Judaism relate to war? Is Judaism horrified? Does it legitimize war? Does it stigmatize it as immoral? Does it glorify war? Above all, to Judaism, is war natural? Is it part of the natural order? What does Judaism have to say on this broad and deep subject? Now, I keep bringing up the word Judaism, which I usually don't. For a historian, Judaism is as Judaism has been. Don't give me a political correct junk about what accords with current norms in the 21st century or any of this idea of, war is this or war is that, the same way that we'll tell you Judaism is in favor of Trump, Judaism is opposed to Trump. Judaism is in favor of this policy, Judaism is opposed to that policy. That's all based on current political correct attempts to try to curry favor by, attaching a Jewish label to ideas that happen to be fond of. I'm saying how historically, Judaism has been around for a long time. It's 3,000 years now. That's a long time where I come from. And it's had a lot to say in subject of war before modern notions kicked in. So what does it have to say? Let us start at the beginning. The Torah does not condemn war per se. The Torah views war as a permanent component of the human condition. In this case, the Torah is like Plato, who famously said only the dead have seen the end of war. The Chumash doesn't put it in those words, but that's what it boils down to. Hence, because the Torah, I repeat, views war as a permanent condition, unfortunately, the Torah has laws of war, halachas. Here you have in front of you, from Dvarim, from Deuteronomy, a whole series of laws. Take a look at them. When you go to war against your enemy, you see the chariots, don't get scared. And in the second paragraph there, the officers, how do they draft the army? Anybody who recently built a house or who's scared, by the time you get to the end paragraph, should leave. And most importantly, look at verse 10. When you march off to attack a city and make its people an offer of peace, and if they accept and open their gates, then all the people will be subject to forced labor, and they shall work for you. See, you kind of enslaved them. If they refuse to make peace with you, the Chumash says, and engage with you in battle, lay siege to the city. I mean, this is in the Chumash. And when God delivers in your hands, put to the sword all the men. Oh boy. So you have in the Chumash orders for a regular war, which involves the massacre of the male civilians. As for the women and the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, take as plunder for yourselves. I repeat, this is in the Bible. And you may use the plunder God gives you from your enemies. This I should, and by the way, this is the nice type of war. This is what you do to the people who are not the Canaanites. In the case of the nations which God is giving you as inheritance, in other words, if it's the 7 nations of Canaan or land of Canaan, kill them all, right? Don't let anyone breathe. You don't let alive anyone that breathes. Wipe out the Hittites, the Perizzites, and all the others. So all I'm trying to say is, even goes on in verse 19 to say, watch out for the ecology. This is where we get Baltashlis from. When you besiege a city, don't chop down the trees. You can kill the people, but don't destroy the ecology. Now, this is not, I repeat, this is in the Chumash. This is not a culture which says war is a horrible thing. It's a culture which says, in other words, to be a boy, it's a culture, war is part of life, it's subject to regulations. You understand? It's subject to regulations. Similarly, the Talmud and the rabbinic literature likewise has, as you see over there in the picture of the Rambam, in the famous law code of Maimonides, one of the parts is Hilchos Melachim Milchamasayim, the laws of war, kings and wars. It's in there. And so, you see that classic Judaism viewed war as part of life. It happened from time to time under various circumstances. And the way you conduct yourself is regulated by how wars are classified. You know, are you fighting this type of enemy? Are you fighting that type of enemy? There's nothing about Appomattox there on Lee and Grant, you know. Now, it is true that Yeshayahu, the Isaiah, and the prophets predict a Messianic Utopia in which lo yisagoy goy cherev v'lo yimadu milchama, that there'll be no more fighting and wars. But and take a look at this verse over here in Isaiah the 2nd chapter. Nochon yiyeh behar Elokim, a time will come when the mountain of the Lord will be established and all the nations of the world will go there. In verse 3, this is the utopia, right? Let us go to L'chun nal el har Hashem. Let's go to the house of the Lord, temple God in Judah. He will teach us his ways and walk in his paths. And Kim Yitzion takes Yisor Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. And then, in other words, once we reach that happy state, in the future, not now, and when all the nations will say, we've been wrong all the time, and the Bnei Israel have been right all the time, and now we lay down and we say, you teach us how to act, because we don't know how to act, we're a bunch of behemoths, then the Messiah, the Mashiach, will judge between the nations and settle the disputes for many peoples. And the Mashiach will say, since you all agree to follow what I'm saying, I'll tell you how to solve all the problems that cause wars now. I repeat, I will tell you how to solve all the problems that cause wars now, and then there will be no more war. Lo yisur goy el goy cherev. It says they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. How many times have we heard that pasuk mentioned? In other words, armaments will be done away with, and there will be peace. And lo yisur goy, a nation will not fight nations again. Sure. And it concludes by saying, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Well, what that means is like this. As soon as you tell me this is a Messianic Utopia, you're saying that until you get there, it's going to be war. I just don't understand. Many people do. I've heard many speeches and many sermons, especially from liberal rabbis, that say Judaism, religion of peace, and we have the vision of Isaiah and all the rest of it. It's not. It views peace as the ultimate goal, right? I'll say this much. The Torah doesn't say one day the Jews will conquer the world and kill everybody. We don't have that at all, okay? We want to enlighten the rest of mankind. And a fundamental aspect of the universal enlightenment that we hope to bestow on the rest of mankind is to settle all disputes without war and put an end to war. That part is absolutely true. But until then, how does it go? Praise the Lord and pass ammunition. Okay? So until then, until this futuristic prophecy takes place, in the natural order of things, war will always be part of human condition. Now, already in the Chumash, in the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, right, the Jewish people begin to move from Mount Sinai. We just did the laning, actually, of Sefer Bamidbar here. God takes a census, doesn't he? As part of a process of forming an army to fight and conquer the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan. In other words, war, or the Bnei Yisrael who left Egypt, is part of the divine plan. The story of the Meraglim, as we all know, coming up soon in the Torah reading, is a story about the lack of military courage. It is not a Quaker story. They say, the Meraglim, the spies, don't say, oh, let us pursue a policy of peace. Stay in peace and love. They say they're too strong for us. They'll defeat us in battle. And Joshua and Caleb say, no, we can take them. Right? We can beat them in battle. It's a military story. On the other hand, like other cultures, the Torah does divide war into different categories or classifications. This is explicit, as mentioned in Devarim and Deuteronomy above, when they differentiated between fighting peoples who are part of the Zion Umos, the 7 nations of Canaan, which is a war of extermination, versus others where it's not. But even then it was pretty bloody. The most interesting classification is between, indeed, limited and unlimited wars. And by that I mean, in unlimited war, there are no restraints. Everyone's to be killed, men, women, and children. This is why the story of the aftermath of Midian battle, Moshe Rabbeinu's time, is very difficult to read. Moses and the Midianite captives, the soldiers come back with prisoners and girls, and Moshe says, why don't you kill them all? Hein hayim b'dvar Bilam. Let me put it this way. It's not politically correct at all. Then, of course, we have Mechias Amalek, don't we? Part of the Torah, a fundamental aspect of the Torah, as you know, is the ever-present commandment to wipe out Amalek. What does words mean? Wipe out Amalek. As a war, you understand? In the Talmudic literature, King Saul, the first king of Israel, was a failure precisely because he was unable to be sufficiently ruthless. It says in the Gemara, Vayar Banachal, which means Aliski Nachal, right? If you can look over there, Aliski Nachal Rav. Notice it's a play on words without going into what Vayar Banachal means, but let's just say it means he had a debate with himself concerning halachos involved with a nachal, with a valley. Dam ba'atzmo. According to this passage in the Talmud, King Saul said, that we have a mitzvah of egla rufa. Then when a dead body is found, you don't know who the murderer was. You symbolically kill the calf, and what you're saying is all the people in the neighborhood should feel that they are worthy of dying because they didn't have law and order to save that person. But in other words, if the Torah makes a big deal about one single solitary dead body found somewhere, then how can God tell me to wipe out the whole Amalek? How can He tell me to wipe out a whole settlement, including the people, the animals, all the rest of it? So in other words, this was considered a fault of Shaul HaMelech. He ended up, as we all know, not killing Agag. He was punished by, number one, being deprived of the monarchy, and number two, being driven insane. All because he wasn't the strong enough, the ruthless enough warrior type. This is why we have, I remember a couple years ago, when the ISIS was running around, Obama's time, and trying to figure out what to do, I remember hearing on the NPR, an American general said, boy, the way ISIS is going, we got to go Old Testament on them, right? What does that mean? He knows the Old Testament, like I just said before. He's thinking of Moshe and the Midian and Amalek and all the rest of it. That's one type. On the other hand, there are other types of war as well. The Torah does not delegitimate milchemes reshus, wars that we can say like now, which are not wars of defense, including wars of conquest. Such a concept is known in the Torah and Talmudic law and all the rest of it. There are various rules and regulations associated with it. But wars of conquest are considered limited wars. There are limitations on the violence. Fascinatingly, when we find in the Bible examples where unlimited violence was visited upon peoples who seem, under analysis, to be involved in a Milchemes Reshus, in a limited war, then the perpetrators of this unlimited violence are criticized. For example, the Talmud criticizes King David and King Amaziah for excessive cruelty. King David fought, for example, in one big war, which I call the War of the Coalition, against a group of nations, Ammon, Aram, and in the middle of it, Edom attacked. And when it's all over, King David went after Edom to punish them for that. And look at what you have in front of you from the book of Kings. When David was in Edom, and Joab, meaning his commander-in-chief, the captain of host, had gone up to bury the slain, meaning the Edomites came and killed a bunch of Jews. So after he smitten every male in Edom. So in other words, Yoav and David went and they said, I guess you killed a bunch of Jewish soldiers, we're going to exterminate Edom. We're going to kill every male. And for 6 months they remained there until they cut off every male in Edom, which means it's a genocide. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the Talmud is kind of conflicted on this. In the Babylonian Talmud, well, let me put it this way: the Yerushalmi, let me go first, says that this killing out of every male, if you take this literally, was a genocide, and this was a stain on the career of King David, and that's the reason, according to the Yerushalmi, that 6 months of his reign are sort of excised from the count because he acted disgracefully. This is interesting. This is the Talmud criticizing King David for excessive cruelty in a Middle Eastern war. The Talmud Bavli, I might say, in Bava Basra, criticizes Joab for insufficient ruthlessness. Okay? It's a whole long story there in Bava Basra, which is a strange Gemara in general, because if you take the trouble to read the account of this war in the book of Samuel and Shmuel Beis and in Divrei Yamim, you'll see that the war against Edom was a defensive war, which in Milchemes Mitzvah, against an enemy which treacherously attacked Israel first. No, they stabbed us in the back. And it's also clear, I'm not sure why, that the Talmud Bavli conflates Edom with Amalek. The Amalekites may have descended from Edom, but ordinarily one doesn't think they're treated that way. So it's a complicated subject. I don't want to go into too great detail. I'm simply pointing out that we find in the Jewish tradition, the old Jewish tradition, side by side with these accounts of genocide and that sort of thing, you find criticisms of this for being excessively cruel and ruthless, which is interesting. In the Medrash, in the Psichta Medrash Eicha, King Amaziah, who was the king of Judah later on, much later on, was severely criticized for an atrocity. Take a look here in the book of Chronicles. It's Amaziah, the king of Judah, marshaled his strength, led an army to the Valley of Salt, where he killed 10,000 men of Seir. Notice he had a war in the Negev against Edom. And the army of Judah captured 10,000 men alive, took them to the top of a cliff and threw them off down that they were all dashed to pieces. So we would call this today, massacres of POWs. And again, the Chazal and the Medrash Eicha, they regard this as an atrocity, a war crime, and it's, believe it or not, it's one of the reasons they assign for the future destruction of the Jewish state, which implies, at least according to one strain of thought in the rabbinic world from long, long ago, thousands of years ago, if the Jewish state acted immorally in the military sense, the excessive violence sense, it lost its legitimacy. It's a very fascinating idea. Now, these are, what I'm sharing with you now are ancient texts written long ago, some which contradict each other, as is the case often in rabbinic literature, which problematize the attempt to say Judaism feels this way or that way about war. There's all kinds of different attitudes. These and other passages, however, indicated in the biblical era, war was a part of life, and like everything else in Judaism, it was subject to rules and regulations. War, per se, was not condemned. Right? You won't find psukim like that. Any more than illness is condemned. I mean, nobody wants the illness, but you don't find illness is condemned. The only religious objection I can discern, the religious objection to war, is the fear of and objection to the arrogance that can be engendered by military success, and arrogance that can lead the militarily successful Jews to attribute victory to their own skill but not to God. When it says famously in the passage, as we know, you may say to yourself in Dvarim, my power and strength have produced this well for me, and really it was God that did so. Okay? So that's a different sensibility than being opposed to war because of violence. It's not a Quaker sensibility. You understand? And indeed, a major theme of Tehillim, and there's King David over there, right? A major theme of Tehillim is David's constant attribution of victory to God, not to himself. L'cha Hashem Agdula, right? As they say, God won the battle, I didn't. On the other hand, let's put it this way. This is not a condemnation of war itself. War is a means of attaining religious as well as political ends. It's not a condemnation of that. Indeed, there's not even condemnation of war for economic ends. As you see over there, under the picture of King David, you have Pishti Yidechem Begedud. Some will remember that in the famous Agadata and Brachos, in the Gemara Brachos, where the Jews are saying the economy is no good, and he said, well, go raid the enemy, the Middle East. Pishti Yidechem, go organize raiding parties and get your money from that way. The horror of horrors. Not at all. Oh yes, one more point. There's a king of the Jews, Asa, king of Judah, who was criticized for drafting yeshiva students. Okay? As it says over there, why was Asa eventually punished? Because he forced the yeshiva boys to, not in frontline positions, by the way, but in labor battalions, more or less. Again, that's not a criticism of war. That's a criticism of the conscription system, which is a different thing altogether. Now, after the Churban Bayis Rishon, because the first Jewish Commonwealth, you're talking about close to 1,000 years, right? From the time the Jews enter the land of Israel, the time of Joshua, to the time the Jews are completely expelled from Israel, by the time you get to the end of the book of Kings and Chronicles, you're talking about 800-900 years. So by the time you get to the Churban Bayis Rishon and the violent end of the Jewish state, obviously, after that, the Jews did not have an army for a long time. So as long as the Jews were in Israel in the first Commonwealth, there were armies. Sometimes they were not standing armies, like in the time of the judges. They were just put together army, like militia that we call today. And at the time of the kings, the king is defined as having an army. But then the kings are no longer, and the state is no longer, and the Jews are in exile, like in Babylonia. And so they don't have an army anymore. So Jews no longer are associated with armies. So when you get to the time of Purim, which takes place during the Babylonian exile, to defeat Haman, it is necessary to resort to intrigue and not to military power. Though the Jews did end up killing, according to the report, tens of thousands of their enemies, I repeat, tens of thousands of their enemies on Purim, they did that, right? So again, the Jews did not turn into Quakers, but they didn't have an army. And how were they able to defeat and kill all these anti-Semites? It was thanks to the support of the Persian army and the Persian authorities. As you read in the famous pasuk, whoever wrote Megillah Esther goes to the trouble of telling you, Chol Sari Hamadinas, Vashtarpani, Bapachas, all the big shots in Persia, V'osei Amlocha Shel HaMelech, and all the high officials of the king, Menasim Esayudim, they helped the Jews, Ki Nafal Pacham Mordechai Aleichem, because they're afraid of Mordechai. So when the Jews battled in Purim, it was let's put it this way, the fix was in. You understand? It's not a regular war. Now, notice, I didn't say no Jews ever fought after the destruction of Beis Hamikdash. I didn't say Jews did not serve in other people's armies. It's strange, but we have certain interesting archaeological phenomena. For example, you see in front of you a map of Egypt with the Nile River. If you look toward the south where it says Aswan, and south of that where it says Lake Nasser, there's an island there called Elephantine, right? Yeb. And I don't know, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, archaeologists dug up, they were shocked to find a garrison, the archaeological remains of a garrison of Jewish soldiers that were working in the Persian Army and may have even been there in the time of the pharaohs. It's unbelievable. And they were Jewish. They weren't exactly 100% Jewish the way we are, but basic Shabbos they heard of. And I remember esrogim they wanted and things like that. They're a certain type of Jewish. And how the heck did a bunch of Jews end up serving in the Darbana southern part near what we call Sudan border of the end of Egypt and the Persian Empire? I don't know. But you see, there were Jews that some of them took up the profession of soldiering of arms. We know from Josephus' account, if it's true, that Alexander the Great wanted Jews in his army. Take a look at this famous description of Josephus. Who's relating what he heard. And he talked about Alexander the Great coming to Jerusalem. And it says, when the book of Daniel was shown him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. According to this account, the book of Daniel was written long before Alexander showed up. And in the book of Daniel, you have the famous prophecy of the ram and the unicorn, where the unicorn destroys the ram. And in the book of Daniel, the angel tells Daniel the meaning of the prophecy, which is that the unicorn is the first king of Greece, which is Alexander the Great, and he will destroy the ram, which is Persia. So, according to this account, when Alexander came, the Jews showed him that, and he was glad, and he dismissed the multitude and so forth. And I'll skip over to the third paragraph. It says, when he said to the multitude, meaning to the Jews, if any of them enlist themselves in his army, on this condition they shall allow, continue the laws of their forefathers, live according to them, he was willing to take them with him, as many were ready to accompany him in his wars. So Alexander basically was saying like this: you join the Alexander Great Army, you can keep kosher, you can keep Shabbos, I won't make you fight like never on Saturday, which is a remarkable story. And for all I know, some Jews did. Obviously, it wasn't exactly what you call, the Maggid Shir and Panovich, but you see that such things were known. Indeed, were there really Jews serving in Hellenistic imperial armies? It's strange. After Alexander died, the empire was divided between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the Cassandras and others, and they had wars and wars and wars constantly. Why would Jews fight in the Seleucid army, the Ptolemaic army? Well, all kind of reasons. Maybe they want to get in and go with the king. Fighting is one way to get loot. There's that famous story in the French Foreign Legion where the French major is walking down the line of the new recruits, and he's asking them what country they're from, and he passes a soldier, and he said, where are you from? I'm from Switzerland. He said, the Swiss, they only fight for money. We French, we fight for honor. To which the Swiss soldier replies, everybody fights for what he needs the most. You understand? So maybe Jews did it as a parnosa. Maybe Jews did it for who knows what kind of reasons. But it does seem to be that there were indeed Jews in the Hellenistic armies. I was Medaic this years ago when a close reading of the book of Maccabees, on one of the good translations of the book of Maccabees. They're not all good translations, the Greek. And you'll see over there the Jewish Maccabees army included former GIs. Look what it says. Siron, the general of the Syrian army, heard that Judah Maccabee had mustered a levy and a company of faithful men about him, along with others accustomed to going out to war. This is a movie. The movie has not been made yet of the Maccabean Wars. Although I remember a couple years ago, Mel Gibson wanted to do so. God help us. But here you have Judah Maccabee. You have Jews fighting in the Syrian army. And as happens from time to time, Judah Maccabee says, what kind of a Jew are you? Come and join me. And they do. So there were Jews who were fighters in that way. The Maccabean Revolt marks, of course, a revival of a Jewish military tradition. As a result of the Maccabean Revolt, the Jews created a Jewish national army for the first time in 400 years. This was the result of cruel necessity. not because the Jews were in love with militarism. The necessity became clear eventually, even to the Hasidim, in what I call the Maccabees incident. If you read closely the book of the Maccabees, you'll see that, I think we all know this, the Jews were a province of the, that time, Seleucid Empire. They weren't causing anybody trouble, mind their own business. They weren't militaristic or anything like that, just want to be left alone. Pay a tax and leave me alone. And then, for whatever reason, Antiochus IV decided to persecute the Jewish religion. And he did do so, him and the Hellenists. And a trapped rat will fight. And as we all know the famous story, when they come to Modin and they try to force it down Matisyo, that provokes a rebellion. And then the rebellion just grows and grows. Because of the military exploits of Judah Maccabee, he turns out to be a natural military genius. So, as a result of that, the Greeks keep trying to come and wipe him out, and Judah Maccabee keeps beating him. And in the course of that, he's forming an army. In other words, you try to wipe me out, I get together a couple guys, try to beat you off. And then you form another army, meanwhile I got a few more guys, and meanwhile I got a few more guys. Next thing you know, the Maccabees had an army. If you read closely the book of Maccabees, you'll find that one of the groups that were in the Maccabean army were Charedim, they call Hasidim, Asadoi. And the real frummies. And they were not, let me put it this way, they were not in favor of fighting, but if they're either hard Yaver, if they're actually out to prevent you from keeping any Yiddishkeit, then we will fight. And they fought valiantly. But there was a very religious point of view, and they basically said, the only reason we're fighting is because there's literally no choice. And if the Greeks will go back to the way they were before and let us keep the Torah, we will lay down our arms. Judah Maccabee, however, told them, you're crazy. Theoretically that works, but the Greeks will never change being Greeks. The leopard cannot change his spot. The Greeks will always try to kill you. They'll always try to force you to violate religion. And therefore, even though I am not a Zionist, and I didn't plan it when I was young of forming an army, this is the way events have unfolded. And we have to maintain an army and drive these mamzerim out of this place. Wipe them out or kick them out. And the story in the Maccabees, if you know how to read it correctly, is that the Hasidim did not agree. And they went over to a Greek general named Bacchides. And they said, basically, we want a flag of truce, and we want to go back the old way. And Bacchides killed them. First, he spoke to them smoothly, and then he killed them. And when he killed them, then it was clear who you're dealing with. You understand? You're dealing with behemoths, and the Greeks won't change. And therefore, there's no choice. Stern necessity causes the Jews to form an independent state and an army. Indeed, the Maccabees were forced over decades to become veteran soldiers, and not only Judah Maccabee, who seems to have been an untutored military genius, a natural, but also Judah's brothers Jonathan and Shimon, became skilled generals and racked up an impressive number of victories. That's what we call the first book of Maccabees. The problem here is precisely the unclarity of the attitude of the religious leaders, the rabbis at that time, or the Prushim, the Pharisees as they were called, their attitude towards this developing militarism, because this is something that was a byproduct of the Maccabean Revolt. The historical sources here are very unclear and confusing. I did a series on this long ago. All historical reconstructions on the period are tendentious, including the one I'm about to suggest. There was a famous division among the Jews at that time between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Prushim and the Saddukim, over the nature of the new independent Jewish state that had evolved out of the Maccabean Revolt and wars. The story of Hanukkah, you know. The Jews are minding their own business, and then Antiochus attacked the Jewish religion. And tortured people and killed them, and this and that and the other, Chan and the 7 sons and so forth. And then the Jews revolted, and they were successful in the revolt. So the people that led the revolt, they were not nationalist intellectuals who were planning from the beginning a modern Zionist movement or something like that, or a modern Polish national, French national movement to found a state. They didn't have a dream to found a state. But it happened. Notice, once they were compelled by necessity to defend themselves against the Greeks, and they turned that they were good at it, son of a gun, I got an army now, I got a state, we kicked the Greeks out. And so, this was funny, because since this state was therefore unexpected, it didn't fit into the Haredi worldview. The same problem you have now with the Haredim in the state of Israel. You know, what do you do with this? There was a division, therefore, among the Jews over the nature of the new independent state that evolved out of the Maccabean revolt. The Frumis, I would say at that time, had the same problem that the Haredim have in the 20th century over the rather sudden evolution of the secular state of Israel. In other words, we have now Medinat Israel. This is a little weird. We all expected in Jewish historical tradition be a Messianic from Jewish state led by a Mashiach figure. Instead, it was modern secular Zionists, led by Ben Gurion, so to speak. It was not the way all these big rabbis envisioned that a state would come into being. And then here it is. What do you do with it? You understand? And what are they going to say? So some people, like the Satmar, say, this is so at variance with the way we understand it's supposed to be, we reject it. And others embrace it. And the Haredim are like in the middle, you know. Same thing at that time. Same thing happened at that time. They had a new state called the Maccabean state. They had a new country called Judea. It was a reality. It wasn't led by Malchus based David, as Ramban famously points out at the end of Bereshis. It wasn't, you know, a Mashiach. It wasn't the way they thought it's supposed to be. But here it is. We have an independent country. So what do you do with it? And just as in modern Israel, once the 1948 threat was over, the Haredim opposed the conscription of the followers. During the war, the Haredim or the Hasidim fought in the Maccabean Army. Look at this. Most people don't know this. Reb Chaim Kanievsky was drafted into the Israeli army during the crisis of the 48 war. He actually gets a pension. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. Here's a thing from an Israeli newspaper. Beis Limuda b'Yeshivat Lamja. Back in 1948, Reb Chaim Kanievsky was in Lamja Yeshiva. Parts of Milchemet Hatzmaut, the War of Independence, the Israel War of Independence, broke out. And as we all know, the new Jewish state was attacked in all directions. And the entire Lamja Yeshiva was drafted in the army willy-nilly and put on the Egyptian border, facing the Egyptian front, Egyptian invasion. Remember, the Egyptians got very close to Tel Aviv. With sticks and stones. Oy vey, if they would have run into soldiers, it would be a bummer. Now, Reb Chaim Kanievsky is actually what you call pattern, Shmuel Grossbar, so the head of the division, Rabbi Grossbar, told Reb Chaim Kanievsky, you sit at the top of the hill and read a Gemara. We'll take care of the enemy. And that's where he was until the end of the battles. The significance, though, is not that story. The significance is that in 48, although people don't talk about this too much, there were plenty of Frum and others. There were both, but there were plenty of Frum that fought in the army because they thought like this. It's a Sakonis Nefashim. If the Arab breaks through, we're all going to get killed. They were on both sides. It's a complicated story. But one thing is not complicated. Once the war was over, then the Haredim opposed the conscription of Haredim. So too, this was the case in the Maccabean state or the Hasmonean state, the Hashmonaim state, that crystallized. It seems from the sources, or at least my reading of the sources, that the Pharisees, who had enough of a theological problem with the Hasmonean as opposed to a Davidic state, were softies in the sense that they didn't want any more Jewish deaths. A large number had perished in the bloody and ugly Maccabean wars. Between the persecutions of Antiochus and the killings, it's too much to explain. And the wars of liberation, and Judah Maccabee was killed in battle, and Yonasan was eventually killed in battle, and Shim was killed in battle, and John Hyrcanus fought in war. Wars. And so the leaders of the Prussian, like many of the leaders in Israel after 1948, they said, we lost so many B'nai Torah from the Holocaust, we need, peace and quiet, as it were. Now that this set of wars had concluded, meaning once they had a Jewish state in the time of Judah Maccabee, or after his death, the Pharisees now sought a policy of peace and consolidation. The state that had evolved, they felt was big enough. Here we have a business of maps. Let's start with I'll explain what I mean. Let's start with the original boundaries of Judea in the Second Temple era, which was a small part of Israel. As you can see over there, that's the whole Jewish area at the time of the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt, before the Maccabean Revolt. 90% of Eretz Yisrael was Goyim. As you can see, the Jewish area was very small. Then came the campaigns of Judah Maccabee, right? Judas Maccabeus, which you can then see expanded a little bit. And then his brother, Jonathan, who added territory, as you can see. So the state got bigger. And then, after Jonathan was killed in battle, Shimon. Okay? So by the time we're finished, look how big the original state was. It basically doubled in size what it should have been. So by the time the last brother died, Shimon, the Pharisee said, Ginuk, it's enough. We have a big enough country. Baruch Hashem, we got what we got. And no more wars. The leader of the Jews, the Hasmonean prince, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, John Hyrcanus, as they call him, said no, for a whole bunch of reasons. He says, we got to continue the wars. It's not the country's not big enough. Basically, if we don't do them, they'll do us. You know, we're surrounded by Arabs and Greeks and all kind of junk, and if we don't take them over, they'll take us over. And so that's the logic of military conquest. You understand? Number two, it's our territory. It's Eretz Yisrael. Whatever we're taking used to belong to us. You know, it was stolen from us long ago. This was his policy, and hence the next ruler, John Hyrcanus, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, as they call him, pursued a continual policy of war, and he tripled the size of the country. Look at the additions of John Hyrcanus. I mean, that's a lot of additions, okay? So by the time he finished, the Jews were the largest single state in the Palestine area. But the price of conquest was civil strife. Specifically, the split between John Hyrcanus and the Pharisees, in which we find the famous statement, Al Tam Natzcham Yomoscha in Pirkei Avos, do not believe in you, that you're safe until you die. Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Shimsh B'Kunah Gdol Shmonim Shana B'Sof Nasa Tzeruki. And John Hyrcanus was a high priest and member of the Pharisees, and then he switched to the Sadducees, because then he attacked them and started a civil war. But does this mean that the Pharisees were anti-war per se? Not really. They were opposed to these specific wars because of policy reasons. And even here it's not so clear, because to tell you the truth, if you know the, let's go to the next one. If you know the Megillus Tainus, as they call it, which is an old rabbinic book, it's a frum book. It lists dates to celebrate on the calendar. To use modern terminology, you don't say Tacht on that day. And including them are quite a number of John Hyrcanus and Maccabean military victories. Look, for example, B'chamisha Sarbei, B'shisa Sarbei, on the 15th and 16th of one of the months. What does it say? Golu Anshi Beit Shan Anshi Bigasa. They expelled the Palestinians as Meir Kahane. The Palestinians who lived in, whoever the group was at that time, who lived in the Beit Shan area, they exiled them. On the 25th, the Hasmonean armies captured the city of Samaria, which was center of the the Samaritan territory. Because it's our territory, they took it from us. And in the celebrated day, John Hyrcanus captured Mount Gerizim, which was the area of the temple. So in other words, the central Eretz Yisrael was conquered, and this was celebrated by the Pharisees. Now this can be explained. I'm simply pointing out that, it's not exactly that he said, oh, it's horrible that there were wars going on. They weren't opposed to wars. Whatever the murky reality from the sources, from John Hyrcanus on, the Jewish state was characterized by a dissonance between military success on the one hand and popular disapproval of the government on the other. And so, the next ruler, Judas Aristobulus, was there for a year actually, captured the whole Galilee, as you can see added on there. So the Galilee is a pretty big territory, right? So again, from the Zionist perspective, from the nationalist perspective, it's good. The guy after him, Alexander Yanai, added even more territory. So by the time we're finished, let's go to the next map. If you sum up all the conquests of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, they reconquered the whole territory of Eretz Yisrael from the old days, from the Bayis Rishon, the 12 tribes. In fact, even more than the 12 tribes. Look how big Israel was at that particular time. The entire Transjordan territory, for example, down to the bottom of the Dead Sea, was Jewish, as a result of one war after another. But who did the fighting? This is always a question of any military society. You see, there are basically 3 or 4 ways to raise an army. You can go the route of universal conscription, but that's really something only in the modern era. You can have selective conscription, which means, after all the fancy stuff, you draft the poor and not the middle class and upper classes. That's usually what you had in history. Or you have an all-volunteer army when you can get it. Sometimes you can do that. Or mercenaries. Now, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmonean princes, John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, and Yanai, used mercenaries, officered by Sadducees. So it was a strange business. These wars were fought by non-Jews who were working in the mercenaries in the army of the Hasmonean princes. Now, when you have a mercenary army, the ruler has more freedom of action. First of all, you don't lose your own people. It's not they who die. And second of all, the army takes orders from you and not anybody else, because you're the paymaster. On the other hand, the army serves the regime. It does not serve the people. If there's a disagreement between the regime and the people, the mercenary army becomes an instrument of oppression, of suppression. Do we not remember the Hessians in the American Revolution? This is what happened in the reign of Alexander Yanai, when the mercenary army killed 50,000 of the Pharisees, of the Pharisees. On his deathbed, King Alexander Yanai realized what a mistake he made because he was universally hated. And he famously said to his wife, "Don't do what I did. Don't alienate the Frum, because you end up being an object of hatred, and win him over." And his wife, Shlomis Alexander, the last independent ruler the Jews have ever had, she pursued a different military policy. She raised a very large army for the purpose of maintaining a policy of peace through strength. So again, it's very interesting. She wasn't necessarily a pacifist. On the other hand, she said that, endless wars are no good. So what is the attitude of Judaism in all this? It depends on the situation. The fundamental instability of a mercenary army, because even she had that, led to disaster under her two wastrel sons, because she left two sons behind her who battled over the throne, and the two idiots, and they brought in the Romans. Okay? And the Romans, it's too long of a story to go into, but let's go to the next one. The Romans, of course, came into Israel, and by the time the story's over, they knocked out both sons. They took over. There you have the famous painting on your left of the Roman army occupying the base of Mikdash, and on the right a drawing where they're killing the Kohanim at the altar. We're talking about the famous Roman general Pompey, right? Gnaeus Pompeius, one of the famous Roman generals, and he conquered Israel, and after he took it over, the Jews never got their independence again. This is in 63 BCE. In fact, I would say, after that time, the Jewish people no longer had a military option. You understand? You're talking about Rome now. Rome is a game changer. All the other countries that the Jews engaged in now were warriors, but you could take them. Nobody could take Rome. The Romans perfected the art of war, and the whole ancient world learned this lesson when they were conquered by the Romans. The Romans raised training of the army to an unprecedented level, and basically they were in training 365 days a year. And the result was that the Romans created, and those you couldn't beat them. You couldn't beat them. The Romans created a perfect military machine in their heyday, and unfortunately the Jews ran into Romans during their heyday. Pompey, Caesar, and those guys. That's the Roman army was at its peak, the legions and everything. And they were like, what do you call it, the cheerleaders, give me a V, and everybody forms a V. Give me an X, then give me a Y. They can do anything. And I'm always reminded in the famous movie Spartacus, take a look at this for a minute, and you'll see, I'll let you watch it, it'll take 2-3 minutes. Watch how the Romans armies, when they want to, the maniples, the units are able to form in like the Rockets or something like that. You can just make them develop into any shape you want, and they're fighting against the Spartacus guys who are untrained, and they're like a silly putty. They're going to fall in their hands. Go ahead, take a look at this. These are not the Romans. You see the Roman army advancing. you get the idea. Now, my point is like this: all the perfect, I don't know, what do you call it, choreography, I guess, uh, was the Roman specialty. The Jews are not in that league. They never were. No, for all of ancient history, the Jews never were able to organize themselves that way. And the trouble is they didn't accept this fact. It was very bitter to say we're now facing the Roman army, and for the next couple hundred years, we just got to get used to it and not mess with them. Instead, the Jews ended up hating the Roman domination, I understand why, and would not face facts. And instead, they developed what we call Messianic movements, in which they persuaded themselves that different people, this is the famous era of the false messiahs. Christianity arose in this period, actually, in which people convinced themselves, true, we can't defeat the Romans al derech hateva, through normal means. But if God helps us, we can do supernaturally, we can defeat the Romans. So if your whole military strategy is to depend on a miracle in the first place, you better get that miracle, and the Jews did not. And so the reality, therefore, was the Jews faced the Romans in what they called the Great Revolt, which was a stupid war on the part of the Jews. They didn't have a chance from the beginning. And as we all know, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the famous rabbi, opposed the war and told the Jews to surrender during the siege of Jerusalem. He was not a pacifist, right? He was not a Quaker, but he was a realist. He said, listen, I understand the military equation. You're going to lose, you understand? And we're going to get wiped out, and the Jews will be killed, the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed, the city of Jerusalem will be flattened, we'll receive a blow that we'll never recover from for thousands of years. He was, of course, as we know with hindsight, completely right. And all this is due to the fact that the Jews, not opposed to war, but weren't exactly a militaristic society, never developed a militaristic culture like Rome or Sparta. It's not who we are, and therefore they couldn't mess with these guys like the Romans. Jewish military leadership during the Great Revolt was low quality. I mean, the famous historian Flavius Josephus was a general, zero military experience. Ive. No wonder he got his head handed to him. And he switched sides, as you know. 6 decades later, the Jews had a high-quality military leader in Bar Kokhba. It didn't matter, right? The Jews maybe fought the Romans and gave them a couple of blows, but the Emperor Hadrian, who was in the time of Bar Kokhba rebellion, sent his best military professional, the General Julius Severus, and it crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt. Without going through the details, the whole Bar Kokhba was a military disaster. Jews were wiped out. And after that, they never recovered. And Yerushalayim was rebuilt as a pagan city, and the Jews were not allowed even to step foot there for 500 years. No, the Jews were busted. Now, after so many deaths and disasters, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Jews, now led by the rabbis, discerned that the best chance for survival in such hostile environments was to renounce militarism and armies, not out of Quakerism, as I keep saying, but out of a sense that the safest tool for survival, though not for avoiding persecution, the safest tool for survival was military helplessness. If the Jews are a zero threat, then you won't exterminate them. You hope. This became the Jewish survival strategy. Don't hurt us, we're not a threat to anybody. It worked, particularly in the circumstances of the diaspora, when the Jews did not have a state, they did not have a church, they didn't have geographical contiguity. There were small minorities in large hostile environments. You can't have a military option, even though it'll tick off some people watching this, and they say every Jew at 22. Not realistic. If you live in the Roman Empire, you live in the Byzantine Empire, you live in the Arab Caliphate. And by and large, the Jews do not fight for the next 1,700 years, 1,700 years, by and large. So we see that the relationship between Jews and war, Judaism and war, very changing, very complicated. But I just conclude tonight by saying it's not true that Jews were opposed to war in principle, or see, peace as the permanent condition, and war as an aberration. They see peace and war as interchangeable, as Plato did. With that, I conclude tonight, and we'll pick this up next time.